Hello, everybody. Welcome back.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, this is going to be another video in my series about learning how to play Pokemon competitively, getting better at it, improving, all that good stuff. The last few videos have been pretty great, honestly. There is last video we had Zach Lesage on here talking about, I called it routing or order of operations. I think somebody else had sequencing was a better name for it. That's probably the name that most people use. But yeah, anyways, today I'm going to try to get a couple of videos in today. I'm just going to be frank with you. I'm traveling to Toronto and then Canada for a week, so I need to get a few videos edited and recorded before that. So, but yeah, today, as the title suggests, this video is all going to be about, what the phrase like play your opponent, right? Not the board. And when we talk about playing your opponent, really the point that we're making here is Pokemon is, the card game, is not a game that is like, you do your turn, your opponent does their turn, and there's no interaction. There is interaction, right? There's cards that can disrupt their hand, reset stamps, Marnies. There's decisions that you can make that should be based to some degree, not just on what the opponent has on the board, but what they're maybe likely to be able to do on their turn. So that's what this is all about. So when I say play the opponent, not the board, right? Might put a graphic up here, something like that. Yeah, what we mean by that, there's a few things you need to be looking for, right? At any point during the game, I would say this about, generally speaking, when you end your turn, right, you'll know what cards you have in hand. I would say generally, don't look at your cards on your opponent's turn. I just think that's a good rule of thumb. Don't look at your cards on your opponent's turn. You have a limited number of options available to you. When it turns into your turn, you can decide what to do. The more you stare at your cards, the more your opponent is going to think that, oh, maybe you're planning to do something and they might disrupt your hand or do something, right? So get a good sense of what's in your cards and then just put your hand down. Watch your opponent. Watch to see what they go and get with a quick ball or a tag call or their Jirachi. Basically, like, just watch them for a variety of reasons, but largely because you want to know what they are prioritizing getting. You want to know if they seem to be digging really deep into their deck for something. And depending on your knowledge of their deck, how that deck plays, you could probably get really good at guessing exactly what they need in order to do what you think they want to do. So yeah, that's the biggest part about playing your opponent. And yeah, you have the game state in front of you. You can determine things, but yeah, don't look at your hand. Follow your opponent was the first rule, I would say. And as you're following your opponent, the other thing to keep in mind is, yeah, what are they digging for? If they are, if they seem to be digging very deep, right? If they're dedenaing and then following that up with a professor's research or some other card that helps them see more cards, or they go into a Jirachi, they retreat into another Jirachi, odds are they're looking for something pretty hard, right? Which means they don't have it in hand. Now, they might get it in hand and they'll get everything they need off, right? But you can learn a lot about your opponent's strategy based on how hard they seem to be digging for whatever it is they might be looking for. And then at the end of their turn, if they don't seem to get it, then you can probably surmise, oh, they don't have what they need in hand to do whatever they might want to do next turn even. So, that might change your strategy a little bit. I think another thing to keep in mind is, did they make any unexpected choices, right? Sometimes your opponent plays something onto the bench or goes and grabs a specific card. It's hard to show you this, like, it's situational, but sometimes like unexpected things in decks that you don't really know is something to keep in mind. If somebody puts like a Ditto Prism Star on the bench, right? That's an indicator that they're planning to evolve into something. What that could be, yeah, you could maybe guess it, right? Like if it's a deck that just wants an extra of a Poipole, right, to evolve into a Naganadel, fine, it's probably going to evolve into a Naganadel. But there is that moment of like, if they already have 2-3 Poipoles on the bench, why did they go get a Ditto Prism Star? Same with Mewtwo Malamar, right? Like they got 2 Malamars up, then they go grab a Ditto. They're probably getting something different. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Like, oh, okay, maybe their strategy is different than what I thought. And that's another aspect of playing your opponent, watching them, right? And then another thing to keep in mind when you're watching your opponent sort of go through their deck and make decisions, is did they seem surprised by anything, especially in the early game? Watch your opponent on their first 2 turns, 3 turns, especially when they are looking through their deck. If you have a good knowledge, going back to the first episode, right? If you have a good knowledge of what their deck likely is, the cards their deck plays, the way that their deck wants to set up against your deck, and then they look through their deck, right? If they're like, okay, I'm searching through, and instead of pulling out what you would expect maybe, that might be a Dedenne in many cases, they don't. Or they don't put down a specific attacker that you think would be really important. Knowing that, you can probably say to yourself, and if they seem, also, this is another thing about watching your opponent, read their face, right? You do this all the time too when you play. Everybody does this. You look through your deck and you'll go like, like you get scared. You don't see something you're looking for, and that means it's probably in the prizes. And being able to watch your opponent, and if they make those weird decisions of not getting a card even, of seeming upset or confused, you can probably guess that something is in their prizes that is critical to them at this point. And with that knowledge, you might play more or less aggressively, right? If you know that Pikarom didn't go grab Tapu Koko Prism Star on turn 1, and they have 2 energy in the discard, and they had a quick ball in hand, and they had everything else they needed, right? If they don't do that, you could maybe surmise that they don't have Tapu Koko Prism Star. So they're going to get 1 attachment for turn, and the next thing on their mind is going to be finding a Thunder Mountain on the next turn. So that might be an indication to you to say, if I can find my Chaotic Swell, that wouldn't be too bad. So those are decisions that you can make if you're just watching what your opponent is doing when they search through their deck. So the next component of this, playing the opponent, not the board, is their win conditions. Like, right? If you know what their win conditions are and how their deck wins and how close they seem to be to doing that, that's pretty important, because those win conditions may not be so obvious in terms of what you see on the board. A good example of this is a lot of the checkmate decks that were popular a few months back, which use the Naganadel with Stinger GX, which would reset all the prizes to 3. If you have an opponent that is, not worrying about playing at a fast pace, getting some things set up, maybe they have a Ditto, maybe they have a Point Ball on the bench, who knows, but you don't really know what kind of deck they're playing, seems weird, right? Well, they could just be setting themselves up for that Naganadel, Evolve, Triple Acceleration, reset all the prizes to 3. And knowing, like, if you see a few cards in their deck that say, I think that's the checkmate deck, then you can say, okay, I need to take out whatever might be able to evolve into that Naganadel early so that they can't Stinger GX me, right? Or maybe they've accumulated 8-10 cards in hand, and they're just prepping basically for that turn. Again, that's a moment where you're like, if I have a Marnie or a reset stamp or something to disrupt their hand, I should probably do that. So that's about understanding their win conditions, how their deck overall wins, and then how close they are to that, right? It can be based on the board state. Yes, you can look at the board state and see what's going on. It could also be their hand state, right? How many cards do they have in hand? In terms of how many prizes are left, right? Like, just because they have a powered up Pokemon that you're going to have to take down doesn't necessarily mean that they're close to their win condition. If they've still got a lot of prizes left to take, or if you know that they don't have any way to gust up a thing that helps them win the next turn, that's a big component of it. So knowing their win conditions is another aspect of following your opponent rather than the board state. Yeah, the next part, which I've sort of touched on a little bit, is when you follow your opponent, you can keep in mind what they might have in hand. So many turns, a player will go and get cards, whether that's Pokemon, trainer cards, etc. And sometimes those players don't play those cards immediately. It may be because they're not useful, you Jirachi. You just pull a card out because you want to thin your deck. It's fine, right? Sometimes the card they pull out that would be very useful on a future turn. So knowing that And this is all about, if you play, poker, anything like that, or if you play blackjack, there's a bit of counting cards that happens here, right? Knowing what your opponent has played, but also just counting throughout every given turn, what cards do they seem to have accumulated in hand, right? If somebody, Jirachis for a custom catcher early in the game, and they haven't really gotten rid of their whole hand or anything since, and then late in the game they Jirachi for another custom, but they maybe don't have the KO, that they probably have 2 custom catchers in their hand, right? Also, another example of this, which is big, is Obstagoon, right? If a player has quick balled for a few Pokemon, has them in their hand, or Virizions, all these different things. There's a card, Mawile GX, that's pretty popular right now in ADP. Knowing what your opponent has in their hand is critical. I had this happen in a game that I played against a friend the other day, where they, preemptively went and got an Yveltal GX and did not put it down immediately. And I thought to myself, okay, well, if they don't do that, I don't have any way of gusting up another Pokemon in order to take some extra prizes. I had a custom catcher prize, but I still had a great catcher in deck. So I was able to go get my Mawile, put it down, make them play the Yveltal GX, and that gave me a target for a great catcher. And that was the difference between, winning and losing that game. So again, keeping track of what your opponent has in their hands throughout the game is also very important. And it's also important because, you want to play cards like Marnie, and you want to be able to Marnie them out of some good stuff. You might Marnie them into good stuff. Impossible to predict that. But Marnieing them out of stuff that they need to win the game is critical. And that's why also a lot of people ask how many cards in hand. I don't know if you do this, you might sometimes, but people ask cards in hand even when they don't have a way to disrupt their hand immediately, because at any point during the game, particularly late game though, you are trying to calculate probabilities. You have to play as best you can to the probabilities. And I was playing a game yesterday against a Baby Blacephalon deck. And, I had them count the cards in their hand. They'd just taken a few prizes. I knew they didn't have everything on board that they needed to win the game next turn. But I suspected, based on the previous turn and how much they dug, that they probably got something off of the prizes that was useful to them. So even though they didn't have the biggest hand in the world, I decided to Marnie them. And the look on, their face when I Marnie them was, it was annoyed, to say the least. It was one of those moments where you're like, oh God, what now? Seriously? Ultimately they actually got there. They ended up winning the game. But it was still a moment where I made the probability far less for them to win the game, because had I not done that, the probability was 100%. So it's all about reducing probabilities when you count somebody's cards in hand and also know how many cards are in their deck. The next principle that I think it's important to talk about when you talk about playing the opponent is also checking the discard. Now, checking the discard is something that you are allowed to do. So anybody who's new out there, if somebody asks to check your discard, they are allowed to do that. You can ask to check your opponent's discard. I would say manners come into play here a little bit. Don't just reach across and grab their discard. Ask, especially if it's on their turn. I would say that you can check the discard regardless of turn, but just be courteous about it, right? Like, this is still a game where people are playing real people. So, just be kind. But yeah, you can check their discard, thumb through their discard, count things that you think they need. That's important, right? Like, for the type of deck you might be playing, you might want to see how many Pokemon catchers or custom catchers they might have played. So you look through and you're like, okay, if they're down 3 custom catchers, you know that they can't do anything with custom catcher for the rest of the game. Now, they might have a great catcher, they might have other cards. That's when it comes back again to knowing what their deck is probably going to be built like. But yeah, that's important. Checking to see how many of a certain supporter they've played. I know in a lot of the Firebox decks, Welder, you want to count how many Welders are in that discard. Have they used their Pal Pad already? That helps you calculate those probabilities I was talking about. So if you do decide to disrupt them or make a choice on your turn to say, I'm going to be more aggressive, you can do that with some confidence, knowing that the odds that they're going to get what they need are a lot lower than you would have expected. So those are all of the key components that I think is important to practice, which is following your opponent. When it's their turn, watching your opponent. Don't pay attention to your hand. Your hand's not changing unless they Marnie you, in which case you have nothing you can do about that. Don't worry about what's in your hand during your opponent's turn. Worry about what your opponent is doing. Understand their win conditions. Understand what they're putting into their hand and not playing down. And then understand what resources they still might have access to based on what they've already used. Yeah, and then in terms of practicing this, I would say you can practice this with your friends at casual tournaments, even at league challenges if it's somebody you're friendly with. Just be, open to your friends and say to them, "Hey, talk through." That's the best way to play test, just to talk through what you're thinking, and say like, "Okay, I know that you went and grabbed this card, and I know that you only need this and this card on your next turn in order to win the game. So I have this in hand. My thinking is that if I play this based on what's in your discard," you basically talk it through. And it not only helps you to internalize that process and sort of do your own math and logic around that, but you get to play it. And then your friend can say, you did a good thing because I did have those things in hand. They can sort of confirm, yes, your thought process was correct. Or they could say, actually, no, I played that card or I discarded that card earlier. And that sort of helps you over time get a little bit better at that sort of game sense of understanding when is the right time to use a reset stamp or a Marnie. I think that's one of those things that for a long time, reset stamp especially, was a card that like I would play it and my opponent would always draw into whatever they needed. And yeah, sometimes that's just bad luck. But I also know sometimes I just played it without even knowing what was in their hand because they might have had a 2 or 3 card hand or even a 4 card hand, but it's totally dead. And they're just top decking, right? And then I reset stamp them potentially into 4 or 2 or whatever good cards. So, but yeah, that is going to be it for this video. This video is a lot more low key than the other ones, but hopefully it was informative. This one was tough. I was like, do I bring in another person to talk about this with me? But I just figured I'd keep this one simple. But there's one thing you take away. Again, focus on your opponent on their turn. Keep an eye on them. Watch what they're doing. But yeah, let me know what you think about this series. Hopefully, I can keep getting a few more videos up over the next few weeks while I am traveling. I'm going to be in Toronto as well. So if anybody out there watches these videos and wants to say hi, hit me up. You can find me on Twitter or comment on this video, but Twitter will probably be easier to find me in the moment than YouTube comments. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in a future video. Carpe Awesome.